Now that we've learned about what an API is, and specifically talked about the JavaScript API and the fact that JavaScript is an implementation of the ECMA script standard, and that with that comes the JavaScript language and the base functionality, that is objects and methods and abilities that are provided to us by the creators of JavaScript. So that API is extremely important to us as software developers. In this screencast, we are going to focus on the global functions that are provided to us by the JavaScript API. We're going to begin with a global function that is called isNan. Now isNan, it is a function that is provided to us by JavaScript that allows us to pass in a particular variable, so a parameter, and it will determine whether or not what we've passed in is actually a number or not. And it gives us a true or false as to whether or not it is a number or not. So let's go ahead and see how this works. Let's say let is not a number equals, so we're going to pass in a string. This is not a number, nor does it contain one. And so here, we're going to use this string and we're going to pass it into the isNan global function so we can determine whether or not what is passed in, the value, is a number. So let's do that really quick and let's see what the result is. Let result equal isNan, so we're going to use that global function, and we're going to pass in is not a number, so our variable that holds no number in it. And let's see what that output is. Let's do console.log and let's put out the result. And then let's go ahead and run our code and see what we get. So true. We get a true, so it is not a number and does not contain a valid number in that string. So that is what we would expect. Now let's go ahead and let's do it again, and let's pass in something that we know is a number. And to make this simple, we're just go ahead and pass a direct number in. So we're going to reuse the result variable that we have. So isNan, and let's pass in something that we know is a number. Let's pass in 99. And then let's do another console.log of that result. And let's see what it gives us. So true that this one is not a number, and false that this one is not a number. Now keep in mind, we're asking the question, is it not a number? And so because this one is not a number, the result is true. Now this one is a number, so asking the question, is not a number, we get a false, and that's because it is a number. So you got to think of how this question is being asked as to what you expect to get back. So false is what we would expect. This really is a number, so the answer to this question is false. Right? So let's do another example, and let's reuse the result variable. And let's say isNan, and then let's pass in a string that holds a number, and let's do 456. And then let's do our console.log of result again, and let's execute it, and let's see what happens. We've got true that this string is not a number because it is just a string with just characters in it. It does not hold a number in it. This one is a number, so of course we expect a false on that question. And then this string contains a number right here of 456, and we get a false even though it is in string format. What happens is that JavaScript in this function automatically takes that string and tries to convert it to a number to find out if the string holds a number. And in this case, the string does hold a number. It is the number 456, and so we get a false. So it really is a number. It's a string that holds a number. So you have to keep in mind that isNan does do an auto conversion of a string to a number. It tries to convert it to a number. So let's see what happens. Again, we're going to reuse the result variable. Let's try is nan, and let's pass in a string. This is not a number, but does contain one. And then after that, let's put in a number 657. And then let's go ahead and pass this one in and see what happens. So we'll do our console.log. We'll run it. And as you probably didn't expect, because this string does contain a number, we got a true stating that this really is not a number. And that is because if we think back to when we learned about strings in one of the earlier videos, when JavaScript does the automatic conversion of a string to a number, it will only identify the string as a number if the number the number that the string contains starts at the beginning of the string. And so here we get a true because there is no number at the beginning of this string, even though there is one near the end. And therefore we get a is not a number. So it ends up being true. So let's try it using result again. Let's do is nan. And then let's do a string again. Let's put the number at the beginning of it. So 657, period. And then we'll say this is not a number, but contains one at the beginning. And then let's see what happens here when we do this. We'll execute it. And here we get a this is not a number. And so we get a true. And here we also get a true. And if we think back to when we learned about strings, what we learned was that the number at the beginning of the string has to be the only thing in the string, and it does have to be at the beginning. So even though we moved the number to the beginning of this string, isNan expects that if it's going to convert from a string, it better convert to a number, and it better be only a number in that string. So it does a very specific check. So it doesn't matter if we have a number in our string anywhere in the string, it has to be a string that is just a number and has no other content in it. So keep that in mind when you are using isNan to determine if information coming in is just a number or if it's a number mixed with strings. So keep that in mind. Now where this is useful is when we get input from a user through a web form, all of that data coming in from that web form is going to be in the form of a string, because that's what's passed over the HTTP connection from the user's browser to our web server. And we'll need to convert it to a number. And usually we're going to want to do that by checking first to see if a number is contained and if it is just a number. So when we get the information back from a form, we may have a function that checks the user input. Function convert to number, and it's going to take in some input. And then inside of the body of it, we may do something like this just to make sure that we're not trying to convert something that is not a number. And we'll say if is nan, and then we pass in the input that we're putting into that function. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to return something like not a number or some kind of error message, right? And then we should send that back to the user to make sure that the user provides us what we're asking for, which is a number. And then if it is a number, then we do something here, right? Parse number out of string. And that's where we get into Parsefloat and Parseint. And that would be something we would do in here. So let's talk about Parsefloat and Parseint. Do the same thing. They parse a number out of a string and provide us with a number that we can use, a usable number. So let's go ahead and do an example of this, and let's capture the result. So we're going to reuse the result variable. We see result is equals, we're going to do a parse float, And in here, let's go ahead and provide a float number. And a float would be anything that's like a decimal. So let's do a 2.345. And then let's do our console.log result. Let's execute it. And we've got a 2.345. And it is now, instead of just a literal float, we've got it as a float object that's been wrapped with the float object. And we can say result dot, and we can call any kind of a function that our float would have on it, or a number, right? Because everything in JavaScript gets converted to a number. So it's now a number in a variable. So we've parsed this and stuck it into a variable. And now we can call any method that number has on it. And so you can go to the JavaScript API, look up number, and then see what kind of things you can do with a number object. So this really isn't all that useful, because here we know to start out with that this is a float. But again, just like up here, we may be getting information in that is in the format of a string. And that's where this isNan comes in handy. And then down here, we would then proceed to parse it if we know there's a number contained inside the string. So here, let's go ahead and let's reuse a result. Let's use Parsefloat. And this time, let's pass in a double or a decimal that is inside of a string, and that would normally be recognized as a string, but contains an actual number in it. And let's do 3.567. And then let's go ahead and do a console.log on that, and let's see what we get back. We get a 3.567 as an actual number now, rather than a string. So now we can call any method, of course, just like with this one, that a number has in the API, in the JavaScript API. So we just go to the numbers section of the API, and we look at all the things we can do with a number. So let's go ahead and let's try, just like we did with the other one, and let's try to parse float on a string that has text in it. This is not a float. And let's see what happens on this. Let's console.log it. Let's put it out there. And we get not a number. So as a result of sending in something that is not a number, we get back nan, or the value that is equal to something not being a number. So let's try this again. Let's do result equals Parsefloat. And let's pass in a string that has a float at the beginning of it, 5.67. And then let's also make it contain some string. This also has some alpha characters in it. And then let's go ahead and execute that, and let's see what happens. We got a 5.67. So here we're actually seeing the same kind of conversion of a string into a number that we saw when we learned about strings back in that original video. Unlike isNan, where even though we had a number at the beginning, we still got back a true on that it is not a number, just like we did on this one. This one, nan, is very specific. The string has to be a number and only a number. It cannot contain any other string parts. Whereas when we are doing a parse float, we see that we can parse out a number that is just a number in a string format. But we can also parse out a number that is in string format when that number starts at the beginning of the string. And let's verify that by doing it when the number is at the end of the string, and let's see what we get from that. So parse float. This is a string with a number at the end, and let's do 6.78. And let's see if we can get it to parse that out. And we got is not a number. And that is because, just like we saw with regular strings when we had the auto conversion to a number when we learned about numbers, we see that if the number is anywhere after the beginning of the string, JavaScript won't parse it out. It will say that this number is part of the text, and therefore is not a number in its own right, and therefore it is not a number. Whereas here, JavaScript assumes that it can discard the rest of the stuff because it starts with a number. And that is behavior you need to keep in mind of both Parsefloat, Parse Int, and when we take a string and convert it to a number. But it operates differently when we're working with isNan. So those are some differences there that you need to keep in mind. So Parsefloat, we get that. Now we'll do Parse Int. It operates just like Parsefloat. We're going to reuse result. We're going to do Parse Int. And of course, if we parse just a regular integer, and then we do our console.log, we're going to go ahead and see that come out as a 76. Now let's parse a number, and let's make that number a decimal. So let's do 45.65, and let's see what Parse Int does with that. Let's go ahead and execute it. And we'll see that it does exactly as expected. Because we're parsing an integer, which is a whole number, not a decimal, it actually parses out just the integer and discards the decimal portion. Now, I say that is expected. You may not have expected that, but it is what I expect, because really we're just asking for the integer part of whatever the number is that is passed in. And for that, we're just looking for that 45. If I really wanted the entire number, I would use Parsefloat to make sure that I got the decimal portion. Now let's see how it does it with strings. Let's do our result equals Parse Int. Let's pass in a string. This has no number in it. And we should expect that we're going to get a nan back on this. And we did. We got a nan, so not a number. And then let's do a result. Let's do a Parse Int. And then let's pass in a string with a number at the beginning of it. So let's do 56. And then let's put some text in there. This has text. And then let's print it out. Let's see what happens. It parses out the 56 because it's at the beginning of the string. It discards the rest of it. Let's do the same thing again, but this time, let's make this a decimal, 56.856. And let's execute it again, and we should see that it only parses out the integer portion of the number that's at the beginning. So let's do that again, and this time, let's move the number to the end of the string, like we did with the Parsefloat. Oops. And let's put this number in there. Let's do the same thing. Let's do a decimal, just for the fun of it. So we've got our decimal. We're going to print out the results. We've got a nan. And like we said, if the number doesn't begin at the beginning of the string, it assumes that this is considered text, or it is in context of the text, and therefore it doesn't look for it. Whereas, on the other hand, JavaScript does say if the number's at the beginning of the string, it's in the context of a number, and therefore it discards the rest of the string. Now, you ask yourself, why does it do that? And that really comes down to the implementation decisions that were made by the creators of JavaScript when they were providing these utility functions for us. So that's Parse Int. Let's go ahead and get to Decode Uri. Now this is really handy because this one we use all the time when we are doing software development in JavaScript, and that is because most of the time we're in the browser and we are interacting with URLs, which is another term for URIs, which of course we all know as the website address. So those are all interchangeable. So URI, URL, web address, whatever you want to call it, it is of course this part of a URL, right? Right there. All right. So we're going to do encode first, and then we're going to do decode. And so I'm going to create kind of a base URL for us. So let URL or URI, whichever you want to use, and we're going to call it URI base, just so that I can reuse it. And we're going to go ahead and do https:// and we're going to do www.neumont.edu. This is going to be the base URL that we're going to be using to build everything from. So let's do a URL encode. Now, where URL encode comes in handy is that sometimes we are trying to build URLs in order to make API calls to a web service or something like that. And we haven't gotten deep into that, but in the future, you'll be able to see where this is applicable when you start calling web APIs like a weather API or something like that. So here I've got the base portion of a URL or URI. And then usually what happens is we've got some information over here that tells us where to go within the website. And if we remember back to the video where we talked about the structure of a website, it's really just directory paths to a file that we want to be displayed, right? So if I was going to the products section of a website and I wanted to look at shoes, it would be products, shoes, and then maybe a specific shoe type. What's a good shoe type? Let's say sneaker.html, right? Or sneakers. And this would have a list of all the sneakers. So this is the path within the website that we're trying to get to, whereas this is the domain or gets us to the actual web server across the internet. So hopefully we remember that from our discussion on websites earlier in this course. So let's get rid of that really quick. So we've got our base URI. Now usually we're getting input from the user or else we are manually constructing the URLs that we want to make a call to at a remote website or a remote API or web service. So let's build a URL, but a lot of times the URL that we're building may have data from a user or from a database or from something, and it may not be in the proper format to be sent over the internet. And that is because a lot of times we may have spaces in that content. So let's use the same example. So let's put it back up here really quick. We're going to use the example of the root of the website, products/shoes/sneakers.html, all right? And so let's say that we're building something, but right here, this sneakers is what we're going to be replacing with something that the user has selected as they're searching our website. So let's do that really quick. Let's say that the path, or the URI path equals, and then let's figure out what we want it to be. So it's definitely going to be products/shoes, and then that's our path to where we want to go. And then let's say let user selection equal, and then let's say that this is what we got back from the web form, and within the shoes section, the user is really looking for some shoe type that has multiple words in it. And from the website, to make it human readable, it's going to have spaces in it. So let's say it's going to be fancy sneakers, okay? And we need to build a URL from that, but spaces in a URL is not allowed. You've got to have a full path. And so they chose fancy sneakers, but that is incompatible with a URL or URI. So we actually need to encode it. So let's build the URI. So we say let, we're going to make it the API call URI equals, and we're going to do our URI base plus the URI path plus the user selection. And if we do a console.log on that, and we look at the API call URI, so let's go ahead and print that out really quick. We see that we've got a space in here. If you look down here in the console, we've got a space. Now spaces are not permitted. A web server isn't going to know what to do with this because of that space. So a URI encode or encode URI, what it does for us is it takes a URI that we've created, it will go through it, and any characters that are not allowed, it will actually provide a code to replace that character that the web server understands. So let's go ahead and do this. We'll do let API call URI encoded equals, and then let's do this, encode URI, and let's go ahead and pass in this API call URL or URI, and then let's console.log it. And we're going to do the API call URI encoded, and let's see what we get back. Here you can see instead of having a space between fancy sneakers, we now have a %20. And the %20 is the URI code for a space. And so now our URI is valid, and we could make a request to another web server, API, or web service asking for this particular page or for the data that's held at this location, and we could get those back from that web service or web server. So URI encode or encode URI, that global function, is really useful when we are building URLs to make calls to web services, APIs, or if we're trying to generate a URL that we're going to send the user to in our web application. So super important. The next one is URL or URI decode, or decoding a URI. And that function right there is really useful because if we get a URI back from something and we want to decode it into a human readable format, we can use the decode URI. So let's go ahead and do that, and let's do that on what we already created, which is this API call URL, and let's see what we get from it. We'll do a console.log, and let's do a decode URI, and let's pass in that encoded version, and let's see what we get back when we do that. You'll see that we get back the original with the spaces that are now human readable. In other words, we got rid of all the special characters inside of our URL. Now, there are a whole lot of characters other than just spaces that are not permitted inside of a URL, URI, web address, whatever you want to call it. And so we're not going to go through all of those. I'll leave that up to you to explore and learn as you are developing in JavaScript. You'll run into a lot of symbols and codes and characters that are not allowed in a URL, and that will require you to encode URLs, and then when you want to use the information in a URL to do something, you'll have to decode that URI as well in order to get the human readable, where all of the special characters that are not allowed are converted back into their normal characters that are human readable. So these are the primary global functions that you will use quite frequently in JavaScript as you're programming. There are other global functions that are a little more obscure that you're not going to use quite as frequently that are out there in the API, and I'll leave it to you to discover those as you are building your software or as you read through the JavaScript API to make sure that you're familiar with it.